The year is 1944. Across the muddy, shattered landscape of Europe, the tide of World War II had irrevocably turned, and yet, behind the thinning lines of the retreating Wehrmacht, an operation of mechanized, industrial-scale terror was reaching its horrific peak. The initial assumption that American and British command structures were entirely ignorant of the Nazi final solution has been largely debunked by historical research. Instead, the issue was one of processing, prioritization, and absolute agonizing certainty. Act 1 begins with the slow, horrifying infiltration of truth into the Allied High Command, culminating in the inescapable knowledge that demanded action. The first crucial piece of the puzzle arrived not as vague rumor, but as precise engineering-level detail. This was the intelligence windfall that became known as the Verba-Wetzler Report. Delivered by two escapees, Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler, who had broken out of Auschwitz in April 1944, the document was not an emotional plea, but a clinical, meticulous inventory. It contained diagrams of the camp layout, the precise locations of the gas chambers and crematoria, estimates of the daily throughput of human victims, often citing the arrival and extermination rates of Hungarian Jews, and descriptions of the train tracks that funneled millions into the complex. The report was verified, translated, and rapidly disseminated through intelligence channels, reaching Allied leaders in Washington and London by the summer of 1944. It confirmed, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Auschwitz-Birkenau was not merely a labor camp, but a gigantic, purpose-built factory of death. The central figure in processing this crisis of conscience was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF. By this stage of the war, Eisenhower wielded authority over every strategic military decision in the European theater. His mandate was singular, clear, and absolutely binding: the unconditional defeat of the German armies as quickly and efficiently as possible. He was the ultimate filter through which all requests for the use of American and British air power, the most precious and devastating resource in the Allied arsenal, had to pass. Eisenhower's operational focus was laser-like, aimed at the destruction of German warfighting capability, the synthetic oil plants, the marshalling yards, the transportation infrastructure, and the assembly lines. Every sortie, every bomb load, and every drop of aviation fuel was measured against the single goal of hastening the end of the war, thereby saving the maximum number of Allied lives. However, the knowledge delivered by the Verba-Wetzler report and subsequent confirming intelligence reports from aerial reconnaissance placed an unprecedented moral burden directly onto the military chain of command. The information moved beyond the desks of diplomats and into the war rooms. The requests to intervene were not abstract, they were specific. Bomb the crematoria 2, 3, 4, and 5 at Birkenau, or, more pragmatically, bomb the 4 rail lines that led directly into the extermination center, effectively severing the supply chain of victims. The rationale was that destroying the physical means of killing, or at least disrupting the transportation network, might offer a temporary pause, saving tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives, particularly those of Hungarian Jewry, whose deportation was then underway. The pressure mounted from a coalition of deeply concerned groups. Jewish leaders in the United States and Britain pleaded with the War Department and the Foreign Office. Even some dissenting voices within the U.S. government, like Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy, were tasked with conveying the requests to the military leadership, though McCloy himself became a key voice arguing against intervention based on military constraints. British intelligence and the Foreign Office conducted their own evaluations of the feasibility of a strike. By the summer and fall of 1944, when the Hungarian deportations were at their height, Allied aircraft were already flying in the vicinity of the camp. They were executing repeated bombing runs against the nearby IG Farben synthetic oil and rubber complex, a vital military target less than 5 miles from the Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chambers. This proximity was the critical piece of evidence that countered any claims of technical infeasibility, confirming that the area was well within the operational reach and bombing altitude of Allied heavy bombers. The decision to strike the factory, but not the murder complex next door, transformed the problem from a logistical challenge into a stark, agonizing moral and strategic choice placed squarely before the desks of men like Eisenhower. The evidence was undeniable, the target was reachable, and the pressure for an explicit moral intervention was intense. The arrival of irrefutable evidence regarding the mechanized slaughter at Auschwitz forced the Allied military establishment into a direct confrontation between the overwhelming moral imperative to stop the genocide and the unyielding, pragmatic demands of military strategy. Act 2 delves into the strategic constraints of 1944, detailing the official operational arguments articulated by the U.S. War Department, the Air Staff, and ultimately General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself for refusing to divert precious air power to intervene in the camps. These arguments were meticulously documented and hinged on the core principle that any deviation from the single goal of military victory would tragically prolong the war, costing more lives overall. The first and most critical argument was targeting priority. Eisenhower's strategic focus was governed by the oil campaign, aimed at crippling Germany's ability to mobilize and sustain its military machine. Every available long-range bomber, the colossal B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, was dedicated to pulverizing oil refineries, tank factories, and vital transportation hubs. The military calculus was brutally simple. Every day the war continued, thousands of Allied soldiers and countless European civilians perished. Therefore, any sortie diverted to a non-military target, even one with a profound moral basis, was viewed as a direct subtraction from the effort to achieve the speediest possible defeat of the German armies. The Air Staff argued fiercely that diverting the necessary resources, hundreds of bombers, escort fighters, and vast quantities of fuel, to attack a target hundreds of miles from the main front would do nothing to hasten the collapse of the Wehrmacht, which was Eisenhower's sole responsibility. Second was the argument of technical feasibility and risk. The technology of aerial bombardment in 1944, particularly when dealing with such small, specialized targets as the crematoria or the narrow-gauge rail lines leading into Birkenau, was highly imperfect. Precision bombing, while improving, was still a crude instrument performed from extreme altitudes to evade German flak. The official conclusion relayed by Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy to his superiors was that bombing the camps was technically unfeasible without creating a double tragedy. The danger was immense. Attempting to destroy the crematoria buildings, which were hardened concrete structures, risked missing the target entirely and instead hitting the adjacent barracks, killing thousands of prisoners, the very people the mission was intended to save. Moreover, the rail lines, while a critical choke point, could be repaired by German slave labor within days, rendering the costly diversion of hundreds of sorties a temporary measure at best. The Air Staff's judgment was that the operation would cost valuable air crews and bombers, fail to permanently halt the extermination process, and potentially hand the Nazis a massive propaganda victory by allowing them to blame the Allies for the deaths of prisoners killed by Allied bombs. Third was the factor of logistical strain and operational range. The closest Allied air bases capable of launching the heavy bomber formations required for the mission were located in Foggia, Italy, where distant bases in England. Auschwitz was positioned at the absolute limit of the operational range for many of these aircraft, particularly the essential long-range fighter escorts necessary to protect the bombers from German interceptors.
A mission targeting Auschwitz required a massive logistical undertaking, diverting substantial air assets and logistical support away from established and critical operational sectors, primarily the ongoing oil campaign that was slowly choking the Nazi war machine. The official military position was synthesized by McCloy in a famous memorandum stating that such an operation could be executed only by the diversion of considerable air support essential to the success of our armies now engaged in decisive operations. The consistent, unyielding verdict from the military command, from the air staff up through Eisenhower, was rooted in this cold, pragmatic conviction. The best, most effective, and ultimately most moral form of rescue was the speediest military victory. Any action that distracted from that primary objective was deemed counterproductive and ultimately result in more death, making the refusal a tragic necessity rather than a moral failure within the strategic framework of the Supreme Command. The immense moral cost was acknowledged, but the military necessity of victory was held paramount.
The official strategic arguments laid out by the Allied Air Staff and the U.S. War Department, which strictly forbade the diversion of resources to bomb Auschwitz, rested on the premise of technical infeasibility and the paramount goal of military victory. Allied air forces were, in fact, operating repeatedly and successfully in the immediate vicinity of the death camp. This juxtaposition, the bombing of the nearby industrial complex, but the refusal to strike the extermination machinery, transformed the refusal from a matter of logistical constraint into a matter of direct, agonizing choice. The centerpiece of this contradiction was the IG Farben synthetic oil and rubber complex, known by the Allies as Monowitz, Auschwitz III. This industrial behemoth was situated barely 5 miles, well within visual range, of the gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The IG Farben plant was a critical strategic target, vital to fueling the German war machine, and thus a high priority for the Allied oil campaign. As early as August and September 1944, and repeatedly thereafter, massive formations of American heavy bombers, primarily B-17s and B-24s, flying out of bases in Italy, Foggia, executed deep penetration missions to bomb the IG Farben works. These were difficult, long-range missions that required the full deployment of resources, yet they were deemed militarily necessary and executed successfully. The flights over the area were not mere technical exercises. They were operational missions that generated invaluable intelligence. The bombers and their photographic reconnaissance aircraft returned with clear, detailed aerial photographs of the area. These photographs, taken by Allied pilots, not only confirmed the damage to the IG Farben plant, but, chillingly, provided unmistakable images of Auschwitz-Birkenau itself. The reconnaissance photographs clearly showed the prisoner barracks, the guard towers, the smokestacks of the crematoria, and the rail spur lines that delivered the victims directly to the unloading ramp, the Judenrampe. These images conclusively demolished any claim that the camp was too distant, too small, or too hidden to be a target. The evidence was literally captured by the planes that had just struck the factory next door. The strategic dilemma deepened with the double loss argument frequently cited by Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy. The official line was that any bombing operation would be a double loss, the loss of valuable Allied air assets and the probable loss of prisoner lives if the bombs missed the crematoria and hit the barracks. This concern about potential prisoner casualties was genuine, yet it was rarely applied with such rigid consistency to other targets. The Allies routinely accepted civilian casualties when striking strategic targets within German-occupied cities, a tragic but accepted component of total warfare. Critics of the refusal argue that while the risk of killing prisoners was high, the certainty of mass murder occurring daily far outweighed the risk of an imperfect intervention. A failed bombing run might have killed hundreds of prisoners. The successful continuation of the system, unimpeded, killed tens of thousands in the months that followed. Furthermore, the focus on the crematoria as the only target was a tactical diversion. Many of the groups pleading for intervention argued that the rail lines were the true military objective. Destroying the rail bridges and marshalling yards leading into Auschwitz would not have risked bombing the barracks, but would have significantly and demonstrably slowed the killing process, buying precious time. Yet these specific, less risky rail targets were also repeatedly refused. This refusal, viewed alongside the heavy bombing of the IG Farben targets just 5 miles away, suggests that the decision was not fundamentally about technical difficulty or logistical range, but about a rigid, inflexible definition of military utility that explicitly excluded humanitarian objectives, no matter how dire the circumstances or how reachable the target. The political will to authorize the operation was simply absent, placing military orthodoxy ahead of the moral crisis unfolding beneath the bomber's wing.
The clash between the moral imperative and the military doctrine reached its inescapable conclusion in the halls of the Supreme Allied Command, where the final explicit rejection of the bombing proposals was formulated and delivered. Analyzing General Eisenhower's ultimate, career-defining decision and the immense moral burden it placed upon him. Eisenhower's singular commitment was to the doctrine of military utility. His final authoritative verdict was encapsulated in the uncompromising statement that the most effective relief that can be given is the speediest possible defeat of the German armies. This phrase was not merely a convenient excuse, it was the foundation of his command philosophy. He genuinely believed, as did the majority of his air staff, that every day the war continued allowed the extermination to proceed across the entire network of concentration camps, not just Auschwitz. Therefore, the strategic diversion of hundreds of long-range bombers necessary to attack a target whose destruction could be swiftly repaired by the German state was seen as an unforgivable strategic error that would lengthen the war, cost tens of thousands of Allied lives, and ultimately result in more victims of the Holocaust. Eisenhower saw his responsibility not as a humanitarian interventionist, but as a military commander charged with destroying the German state itself. This military orthodoxy was further reinforced by the consistent and unyielding advice from the U.S. War Department, primarily channeled through Assistant Secretary John J. McCloy. McCloy formalized the argument that any attempt to bomb the rail lines or the camp structures would constitute an unacceptable diversion of air support essential to the success of our armies now engaged in decisive operations. The logistics of the campaign were so finely balanced, the need for long-range fighter escorts for deep raids, the limited supply of specialized air-dropped bombs, and the constant demand for sorties against high-priority synthetic oil plants, that to commit to a complex humanitarian mission was viewed as an act of tactical self-sabotage. The entire military machine was geared toward one goal, and any non-military objective, no matter how morally compelling, was seen as corrosive to the primary mission. The moral burden placed upon Eisenhower was immense, requiring him to enforce a decision that contravened a profound humanitarian instinct. He was forced to confront the moral implications of prioritizing military efficiency over immediate humanitarian intervention. The argument was that the liberation of the camps, though delayed, would be absolute and complete only upon the successful advance of the ground invasion. To attempt a flawed, symbolic, and potentially disastrous airstrike was to risk the integrity of the ground campaign, which alone held the promise of universal liberation.
This adherence to the principle of liberation through victory placed the responsibility for the lives saved and lost solely on the success of the land invasion. Eisenhower's mandate did not include the use of military assets for missions of symbolic retribution or humanitarian risk. It was strictly confined to achieving the fastest possible victory over the enemy's armed forces. This verdict led to a clear contrast in the accepted use of force during the war. Allied command accepted the tragic necessity of mass civilian casualties when bombing German cities and strategic targets within occupied territories, the accepted brutality of conventional total warfare, because these actions were deemed directly conducive to military victory. However, intervening directly in an act of genocide, a non-military target, was categorized as a diversion, fundamentally placing it outside of the permissible military action. The decision solidified the military's view: the tools of war must be used exclusively to defeat the opposing military, and the moral response to the Holocaust had to wait for the final triumphant act of the armies. The cost of this adherence was the continued operation of the gas chambers until the camps were overrun. But for Eisenhower, the cost of deviation was the potential prolongation of the entire global conflict.